we were over there trying to get that out to everyone. So, thank you. Well, hello everyone. I'm Jake Wyman at the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's edition of Capital Clarity, which we talk about something that has been a long time coming: dismantling DEI in higher education. DEI is on its last legs. Now it's time to put the final nail in the coffin here in Idaho and stop the divisive and harmful woke agenda from infecting our higher education. For example, last November, BSU made a statement that they will shutter their DEI offices, including their Student Equity Center and their Gender Equity Center. This was done in compliance with the State Board of Education's resolution made last year to dismantle DEI offices in higher education. This also comes off the heels of President Trump's executive order earlier this year to prohibit DEI in higher education. Sounds like a win, right? Well, despite this, BSU found a way around this by reorganizing their DEI offices under the guise of Student Connections and Support Center. This center continues to promote woke, far-left, DEI-inspired services. This is why we need legislation. It's time for DEI to be a thing of the past here in Idaho. Luckily, we have some of the experts on how to do so here. Our first guest speaker is Samuel Lair, IFF's own director of the Center for American Education. He's a PhD candidate at Hillsdale. He has written extensively about the DEI-inspired curriculum that has made its way into Idaho's social studies standards, and his work has been published in the American Mind, a Claremont Institute publication, by the way. Please welcome Samuel Lair.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Again, my name is Samuel Lair. I'm the director of the Center for American Education. My comments can be brief. We have two great guest speakers here today that I really have more substantive talks. I'm just going to focus on kind of framing the issue for us. You know, what is DEI, what it does, why we're here today, and why it's a major issue. This is important because if you paid attention to the state board's decision in December, they actually really wrestled over the question of like, what is DEI? Even in their initial action, they kind of admitted that they only have a tentative definition and that they're obviously not 100% sure what it is we're trying to identify here. So I'd just like to do that for you guys really quickly. So DEI, diversity, equity, for inclusion, sometimes put in other acronyms such as belonging and justice and so on and so forth, is essentially a set of governing principles adopted by institutions. DEI not only informs how an institution operates, but it by and large becomes an all-encompassing goal within itself, that goal being social justice. That framework of social justice is important because to truly understand what DEI is, what its goal is, you kind of have to go back the intellectual history a little bit to something called critical theory, sometimes more colloquially known as cultural Marxism. Now, that term cultural Marxism has a hinge of rhetoric to it, right? It sounds like a political catch-all, but it's actually an accurate assessment of what critical theory is. Critical theory is a political ideology developed in the early 20th century to the mid-20th century that derives the Marxist intellectual tradition. The orthodox Marxist political theory kind of views society within the framework of class warfare, this battle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich and the poor. Cultural Marxism tries to take those same fundamental perspectives, the same way of viewing things, and applies it to issues of culture, race, gender, so on and so forth. Critical theory here, what it does is implied within the name itself. It is a critical theory. What is it critical of? It's critical of Western society. Now, critical theory has a range of subfields, if you will, many of which you might be familiar of. The most popular or well-known one is critical race theory. Others include post-colonialism, which focuses on this notion of settler colonialism. Other radical forms of feminist theory are also a part of this tree, as well as queer theory, which is where we get gender ideology and the push to trans kids. Now, these theories have been dominant in the American university system since at least the 1960s. And for a short amount of time, they stayed primarily there, kind of this incestuous form in which they would educate the next PhDs of the future generations. They'd all kind of just stay in their little cabal. But also, during the 1960s, there is well-intentioned legislation in regards to the Civil Rights Act. And unfortunately, the legal framework created by the Civil Rights Act was the perfect avenue through which proponents of critical theory and DEI were able to use that in order to circumvent traditional understandings of equity and equality in our American justice system and implement this more radical framework of social justice. Now, why is DEI a bad thing? What does it actually do? Now, there's really 4 things here that I believe that are core. So, 1, it promotes discrimination through policies such as affirmative action, or by giving students special privileges and access to resources that aren't available to other students. Now, while affirmative action has been struck down by our Supreme Court, at the university level, you still have, or at least did to most part, and they're still kind of there, these student resource centers that would give special privileges and resources to African American students, for example, or give them special graduations where only Latinx individuals can go to this graduation and get a special sash and things. Second, DEI is also a threat to our fundamental liberties, namely our rights to free speech, and it does this through the creation of biased reporting systems, which operate throughout all of our major colleges and universities in Idaho. What these things do is they try to police thought crimes, that you said something that hurt someone's feeling, and it might be because of a bias. So how do you how do you solve this solution or this problem? It's simple. You do bias trainings. What are those? Well, every single person in this room, according to critical theory, you are a racist, you are a sexist, you are a bigot, you are a homophobe. And those are deeply ingrained within your psyche. But luckily, there are good, well-meaning administrators in Boise State and University of Idaho that are willing to go to our children and deprogram them from their implicit biases and free them from their prejudices that have held them down. Third way that DEI kind of encroaches on the institutions, another problem, is that, as I kind of intimated earlier, it's essentially an institutional ethos. It transforms the purpose of a university from producing doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers to creating radical political activists. And you might go, Sam, that's kind of polemic. Like, what evidence do you have of that? I'm like, well, you don't have to take my word for it. This is the University of Idaho's Writing Center's anti-racism statement. Now, I don't know about you. I mean, I've gone to college for maybe too many years, but I think a writing center is supposed to be about helping you with grammar, maybe helping you with an argument you're having difficulty developing. This is what the University of Idaho believes that its writing center should be focused on. Quote, "We recognize our cultural context, which includes the growing and overdue awareness of structural racism in the United States and its academic institutions. As the writing center is situated in academia, we see our work as entwined with issues of structural racism and are committed to actively working against it. It is our position that it is not enough to not be racist, thus we are anti-racist. To this end, the Writing Center of the University of Idaho commits itself to educating ourselves about social justice, anti-racist theory, praxis, and the intersection of structural racism with writing and academia. This includes incorporating diverse voices and perspectives into our tutor education course and professional development activities. We recognize that our work follows in the footsteps of generations of anti-racist activists, scholars, and advocates. As we foster a culture of anti-racism in our writing center, it is important to recognize, study, and implement their work and ideas." Related to this, which is to me is the most fundamental issue, is that DEI, critical theory, cultural Marxism, whatever you want to call it, is the self-declared mortal enemy of Western civilization. All of these subfields I've spoken about, they view American society within a single framework. Critical race theory views American society as fundamentally racist, built upon white supremacy, and therefore all existing power structures that hold up that tenets have to be torn down. Post-colonial theory views American society as built upon settler colonialism and the genocide and theft of indigenous lands. Therefore, we have to destroy the existing power structures and restore indigenous lands. Feminist theory views American society as fundamentally built upon the theory of patriarchy. Therefore, we need to tear down the power structures of patriarchy and liberate the sexes. Queer theory, America is built upon a fundamental basis of heteronormativity, and therefore we need to tear down our natural family values and instead embrace polymorphous perversity. Great term, by the way. Put simply, cultural Marxism aims to destroy the American way of life as we know it. And it seeks to do this by indoctrinating our children and turning them against their political and cultural heritage. The Idaho Freedom Foundation is proud, with the help of everyone in this room, to stand in the way of this radical agenda. And with that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Scott Yenor of Boise State. He's also a Claremont Fellow, and he's going to be introducing some of the efforts that Idaho has been doing to try to circumvent this in the past, some of the work he's done both in Idaho and the state, where he's been on the front line of this fight. Thank you.
That's good. That's good. Yes. Swell. Well, thank you all for coming out. Yeah, my name is Scott Yenor. I'm Senior Director of State Coalitions at the Claremont Institute. And I'm a professor at Boise State for a little over 20 years. It's great to live in the Valley. It's great to live in Idaho. And I appreciate that Idaho is playing a little catch-up now when it comes to other states, when it comes to DEI bans. Sam's predecessor and I wrote several reports on the strategic plans that the University of Idaho and Boise State especially, but the other universities too, had with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion way back in 2020. And Idaho's legislature has known about the problem, and they've actually taken action more than once since those reports came out. And so we were actually one of the first states to take action against the problem of diversity, equity, inclusion in the country. And other states, I think caught up quickly and surpassed Idaho. And it seems to me that Senator Toews' bill is going to be one of the things that helps Idaho really catch up to the excellent work that's been done in places like Florida and Texas and Iowa. And so I really am very optimistic about the bill. Now, one way to think about the universities is to think of them in like we have departments and we have administration. Departments are the people who offer classes, and administration are the people who kind of handle the policies of the university. And when we think about critical theories or diversity, equity, and inclusion, we should think about each of these separately, I think. I've been, I got into academia in the 90s, and it's not like I didn't know what I was getting into. I wasn't naive. I knew that the universities were, for the most part, very leftist oriented, and the new triad was race, gender, and class when I was preparing for my PhD. And most of the professional norms and most of the disciplines in the social sciences and humanities were infused with these critical theories. It was kind of how they approached the job that they did as a psychologist or as a sociologist or an anthropologist. And so it's not like crazy, or at least it was very expected for me when I came to a place like Boise State. And most of my colleagues were very much into critical theories in their research and teaching. And that's what I call the bottom-up phenomenon of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the old problem for when I was young that we called it the tenured radicals. But back then, I would say that the administration had an attitude toward the faculty like, we need to have adults in charge because your approach is both going to get us into trouble and also very one-sided and very political. And so when the millennium changes from the 1900s to the 2000s, I think most faculty were, like trending to the left. The ratios of conservative to liberal faculty were getting to the point where they were like 3-to-1 to 7-to-1 at that point. But the administration was like, saw this as a problem. And so that's one way, the bottom-up problem, the tenured radical problem. And then what has developed over the last, really, very radically since the Floyd riots, but really since 2010 or since the Obama administration, is what I call the top-down problem of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is where the administration itself are the people who are pushing racial preferences in admissions and in policies and in curriculum and designing the entire university, or that's an overstatement, but designing the university to feature most prominently diversity, equity, inclusion in its ethics. So you'll see it start to be sewn into strategic plans. And then you'll see universities like University of Idaho did in 2016-17 to sew diversity, equity, and inclusion into its own strategic plan. In 2017, it happened at Boise State, where then President Bob Kustra put together a commission on diversity and inclusion, and they came up with a plan for how things were going to proceed over the course of time. So that ends up, as I say, shaping curriculum, but also shaping the faculty, because the faculty, the university's administration is going to want to build programs that attract faculty that promote diversity, equity, inclusion. So you'll get, at some universities, Boise State already had this, but you'll get women's studies programs or black studies programs or queer studies programs, or you'll get special faculty positions that really seem dedicated to hiring underrepresented minorities. So you'll get like a communication line. This is just an example, not a real example, but like how blacks communicate. You'll get like that subfield will end up featured. The university's administration will be really happy. And if you can find someone to fill that faculty spot, they will find the money to hire that person. But if you can't find someone to fill that faculty spot, at least not an underrepresented minority, they won't fill that faculty position. So there's both of these problems, right? There's this bottom-up problem of kind of the intellectual corruption of various disciplines on the university. A separate problem, but not like totally separate, is this top-down problem of policies that the university adopts in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion. And the work that we have done, or by we I mean me and Anna Miller, was Sam's predecessor at IFF, and a very good friend who now has 2 children, is living in Utah, and is very happy, for those who knew Anna. And yes, I could show you pictures if you want later on. She's when I told Sam he had big shoes to fill, but like then I saw Anna, like he does have big shoes to fill. And you know, we charted what was happening in Idaho. We showed what the strategic plans were like. We did things like finding statements like Sam read from the Writing Center at the University of Idaho. We just tried to show like how many personnel were dedicated to this. Now, the University of Michigan, it's a mountain. Like there are 300 people at the University of Michigan dedicated to this idea, the administrating diversity, equity, inclusion. At Boise, it's not a mountain. It's a smaller mountain, at least. It's a foothill, or maybe higher than a foothill. I don't know the exact geographical thing. It's not the University of Michigan, is what I'm trying to say. It's not Ohio State University, which makes it actually easier and more necessary to consider how to take the top-down portion of the university that is promoting DEI and deal with it, like put limits on what they're doing. And that's, you know, I think is one of the things that the state board like wanted to make sure that it looked like was happening in their statement. And it's one of the things I think that Senator Toews' bill will really help cinch. That is, I think Idaho's bill will have the most comprehensive coverage when it comes to DEI and its definition, and then very effective, or hopefully very effective, it all depends on personnel, enforcement mechanisms while it runs. So let me just say a couple more things about this, all right? So I said that Idaho was playing catch up because a lot of other states like Florida and Texas had already gone after the DEI administration, the top-down problem, and that's good that we're playing catch up. But there's another way in which we're going to be playing catch up, because the Trump administration has some very strong and interesting diversity, equity, and inclusion executive orders and dear colleague letters that have been released to universities. And what the Trump administration is doing, the executive order is 14173, and it's called like Ending Illegal Discrimination and Supporting Merit-Based Opportunity, or something close to that. I wish it were better, but I just can remember 1473. It's very easy to remember. 14173, excuse me, 1473 is a great year, but there's another number in there. 14173 is the number of the executive order. And what the Trump administration is doing with this executive order is returning to what we might call civil rights originalism. All right, so originally, the Civil Rights Act is designed to go after individual acts of discrimination by one person against another person. Right, almost immediately after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, President Johnson issued an executive order in 1965, which says, nah, forget about the individual acts of discrimination. We're going to be measuring this on a broad basis. If groups seem to have different outcomes, we're going to assume that discrimination has had something to do with those group outcomes. So when we find group outcomes different between, say, blacks and whites or men and women, we're going to have a presumption that the policy is discriminatory. And we're going to try to get rid of those policies. And we're going to have judicial oversight and bureaucratic oversight to get rid of those policies. And what President Trump's, and this led to like an unbelievable expansion of the civil rights regime. When I speak about it, I always call it our reigning civil rights ideology. But since President Trump has declared that reigning civil rights ideology like out of bounds now, we'll have to call it something else. But we'll call it our old civil rights ideology, which was the disparate impact regime. If your policy has a disparate impact between the races, it's presumptively unconstitutional. And since almost every policy has a disparate impact among the races or sexes, everything is presumptively unconstitutional. But that doesn't mean we can't try to bureaucratically re-engineer the world. And so DEI policies on universities are one big attempt to re-engineer the world. But President Trump has taken that analysis and applied it to all areas of government. So there used to be contracting. If a certain number of contracts or percentage of state contracts have to go to minority and women-owned businesses. That's a way of remedying past discrimination and making up for problems of group disparities. Like, that's now out. So President Trump's executive order is helping to return the country to civil rights originalism. Whether that's a sustainable position is a different question. But the idea is the whole disparate impact regime is now against the federal law, as President Trump is interpreting it in the executive order. No one thought that could happen. No one thought it could happen. And with a stroke of the pen, and probably he's going to go through the Administrative Procedures Act, so it'll be more than just a stroke of a pen. Like, there was a quiet revolution that happened, and civil rights returned to a completely different, vision of what civil rights are that we've never actually had, because we almost immediately went into the disparate impact regime. So now it's important for state governments to realign themselves with the values and structure of President Trump's executive order, 14173. And that's what I think Senator Toews' bill does. So Sam talked about something, and I want to put a little different spin on this, which is consistent with what he said, but I think is another way of looking at it. What is a bias reporting system? One of the great innovations of Senator Toews, President Toews, I mean, we're hoping, right, maybe someday, Senator Toews' legislation is that it's one of the first to ban bias reporting systems. Well, what a bias reporting system assumes, one, that the environment in which people operate is inherently biased against underrepresented minorities, and that underrepresented minorities would never lie or say anything dishonest when they're reporting bias. That is, their own subjective feelings guide it, but their own subjective feelings are like purer and more accurate than those from the majority culture. So President Trump and his executive team hasn't done this yet, but I can completely see bias reporting systems being ruled out by his executive order. Idaho should lead the way on that. Idaho should lead the way in showing that we reject these particular kinds of practices and policies imposed from the top down by university administrations, right? This is also going to mean that how the university contracts is going to have to be divorced from the old disparate impact regime where we reserve a certain number of percentage of contracts for minority and women-owned businesses. Both of those things are not going to be, immediately suspect, I think, under President Trump's executive order. And Another thing, and this will be my last point, that I think, this isn't a direct application of President Trump's executive order, but it's another real benefit of Senator Toews' bill, is that it has a very effective mechanism for enforcement. Like, I've been involved in helping to craft the bills in Florida and in Texas, and the executive actions in Iowa and Wyoming. And the enforcement mechanism is always the hardest. And ultimately, the enforcement really falls onto the personnel of the university. Like, the personnel of the university have to be in favor of the law that you're passing. If they're opposed to it, it's very difficult to lever and to oversee every action. So ultimately, like, personnel is policy. This mechanism comes the closest to, like, overseeing and controlling hostile administrators. There's a large chunk of budgets that can come out of what universities get from the state if they violate a policy. And this is the hardest thing to sustain through legislative process. There's a private right of action. So people who feel they've been wronged have now a private right of action. So you don't have to rely on another bureaucrat to sue a state. Private citizens under this bill can sue a state. So, you know, you're going to hear a lot of complaints that the definition of DEI isn't succinct enough or isn't clear enough. Let me just talk about that for a second. To me, this is one of these straw man arguments. When we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, no one thought that meant men and women's sports. No one thought it meant that. When we passed the 64 Civil Rights Act, no one thought it meant disparate impact. And in fact, members of the Senate said, if it ever means disparate impact, I will eat the bill. Like, physically take the words out of the book. Hubert Humphrey said he would eat it. And in 15 months, that's what it meant. The vagueness is a selective argument that is used against our side on this. We should have a good conscience and recognize that we have defined diversity, equity, and inclusion way more comprehensively and honorably than the other side has ever attempted to define anything in their lives. Feel good about how it's being done, and the bill will have a nice impact on restoring people's confidence in public education in Idaho. Thank you.
All right. Please give it up again for Dr. Scott Yenor. Our final speaker is Senator Ben Toews. Senator Toews is the sponsor of Senate Bill 1048, which would ultimately put an end to DEI in higher education here in Idaho for good. It is the most extensive DEI bill in the nation, and he's here to talk about it today. Please welcome Senator Ben Toews.
Well, thank you all for being here and for interest in this important subject. I want to start out by talking about really what the end goal of this legislation is. That end goal is to make our institutions of higher education a place where we seek truth, not social justice. The problem is that we have drifted from what we all know is the real purpose of higher education. And to the degree that we've drifted, our society has drifted as well. So what the real goal is, and we're going to go through a lot of detail, but what the ultimate goal is to make our higher education institutions a place where students can go. They can debate everything. They can have critical thinking and conversations and exploration of ideas. And they can seek truth. And to the degree that we do that, we will see our society start to move in the right direction. So my 17-year-old daughter, she told me this last weekend when I was home, she has a different definition of DEI. Now, this isn't the definition that's used in my legislation, but she said to her, it is destroying equality intentionally. That's what it's done. That's what it's done in our state. That's what it's done in our nation, is it's actually destroyed equality intentionally. So how do we get rid of it? Well, this bill, Senate Bill 1048, draws from a lot of other states and a lot of other sources to try to put together an excellent solution. I would say a best practices solution from across the nation. And I'll go through a little bit of our sources of where the parts of the bill came from. Our definitions, we drew from the Iowa DEI bill. We drew from Harvard and University of Washington's own websites. This is what they say DEI is. So if somebody says, well, I'm not sure if that's what it means, this is what the people who are pushing this say it is. So what better source than that? We also pulled from a Texas bill as well. As far as the DEI office definitions, we pulled from Iowa. As far as DEI office prohibition, from Iowa, Texas, Alabama. For implicit bias reporting system prohibition, we used speech first model legislation. And I could go on we had a part that's from Florida. So we've gone and we've looked at what's working across the nation, what's actually having the effect that we want to see in the great state of Idaho. And then we put together a bill that would do that. So let me walk you through the bill really quickly. And I'm going to start out, first of all, our bill is called the Freedom of Inquiry in Higher Education. That is truly what we're after, is a freedom of inquiry in higher education in Idaho. I'm going to read the bias reporting system definition. I'm not going to read all the definitions, but I want you to listen to what we are trying to do away with this bill. Bias reporting system means any office, department, position, or system whose function is to investigate, threaten disciplinary action, or otherwise punish enrolled students for expressions of speech protected by state and federal law. I'm going to read that again. Protected by state and federal law. All we're doing is saying our institutions of higher education cannot chill speech that's protected by law. Is that too much to ask? I don't think so. But the reality is that our bias reporting systems that have been in place have done just that. They have chilled speech. They have put our students on notice. Our college students have been on notice, and they've watched the effects where their friends are called out because, here's some examples. They've had disagreements of opinion, political beliefs or affiliations, perceived bias, prejudice. They've used stereotypes or intolerance. These are the things that we can't be enforcing these things on our students and expect our students to comfortably seek truth and have the conversations they need to have in our universities. To move on, the first few pages is all definitions. We have almost 4 pages of definitions. As far as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, it means trainings, programs, activities, or instruction designed or implemented in accordance with the tenets or concepts of critical theory. What does that mean? It means when you look at things through this lens, through the lens that says everyone is either an oppressor or an oppressed, right? Everyone is a victim or an oppressor. So that lens, that critical theory lens, is how we define DEI. It goes on to include implicit bias, microaggressions, internalized racism, cultural appropriation, structural equity, settler colonialism, group marginalization, anti-racism, systemic oppression, social justice, institutional or systemic racism, white fragility. I could go on. It names all of those. Where does it get those from? Well, I told you the sources where those came from. A lot of those are coming from the websites, from the very DEI offices at these other institutions of higher education who are pushing this. So after the definitions, we go on to the meat of the bill, which is, we say no institution of higher education in the state of Idaho or any employee, appointee, or committee acting on behalf of an institution of higher education shall, we say they can't discriminate in admissions. This is actually just codifying a Supreme Court decision from last year. You already can't do this, but let's put it in state law and make it really clear. You can't do this anymore. You can't discriminate against people in the admissions process based on, their race. You can't apply a point system that gives some people negative points to try to equal things out. That's craziness. You can't discriminate in hiring. I mean, to me, this is like grade school level stuff, isn't it? Did you guys all learn this in grade school? You're not supposed to, in hiring, you're not supposed to treat anybody differently based on the color of their skin, right? So that's what we're doing here. On hiring, you can't do that based on their race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. We say you can't have an office or a DEI office or DEI officers. You can't have forced DEI training. We do away with the bias reporting that I already mentioned that chills free speech on our campuses. We do away with faculty requirements that faculty has to go through some type of training, DEI training. We offer exemptions for courses that might, students could choose to be in some type of program that studies this. That's fine. We're not trying to take away people's ability to learn what they want to learn, but we want to make sure that people aren't forced to do so. I missed one important provision, which is that it's prohibited to establish curricula or designate courses at the institution in a manner that requires or otherwise compels a student to enroll in a DEI-related course in order to satisfy the requirements of an academic degree program. So you can't force students, you can't force this social justice information. Sorry, I almost used a different word. You can't force that information onto our college students. So how do we, I mentioned the exemption already. There's a reporting requirement. We have to, it's required that there's a report prepared and that there's some oversight. But how do you enforce this? So the enforcement is from the Attorney General. And I can tell you, I've definitely heard the idea that we should have the State Board of Education should be the enforcement mechanism. They should be in charge of this. But the problem is that how did we get to the place we're at now with them in charge of it? So I think there may be a time in the future where we would shift that back over to them. But right now, for a period of time, I think it's totally appropriate. The Attorney General oversees the enforcement of this legislation. So what does that look like? After a process where the Attorney General can essentially put the university on notice, if they're still violating this law, the Attorney General may seek civil penalties for any violation of this section up to 2% of the amount of the institution's operating expenses budgeted for the state fiscal year preceding that in which the violation occurred. So it has up to, I think is really important. That can be a large dollar amount. It's a serious threat, and there needs to be a serious threat. But the reality is that there could be things happening that are accidental. There could be minor errors. And so that up to allows the AG to have discretion and say, this is minor, we just need this fixed, and it may be a small amount. So, but if there is continuous, and egregious violations, then there has to be some way that we enforce this. So the AG has that ability. This legislation also gives the students and faculty a private cause of action that would allow them to seek injunctive relief. That's not too much to ask. That means that a student who's being forced to take a class can go to the AG or that can sue and say, you're forcing me to take this class, fix it. And a judge can force that. So injunctive relief is, I think, a pretty light touch, but it does give students and staff the ability to get things fixed if the AG isn't doing it for whatever reason. Now let's talk really quickly about what this legislation doesn't do, because frankly, usually the press likes to give you all the scary things that it's going to, do away with free speech. Obviously, our goal is the opposite of that. It's going to ban things. They love the word ban. So it's going to ban DEI. I'm sorry, that's just absolutely false. So we actually detail out in the legislation that it doesn't do that. So here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't limit research by students, faculty, or other research personnel of the institution. It doesn't limit creative works by students, faculty, or other personnel. It doesn't limit activities of student organizations. Like it or not, we want our students to have the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and they're going to have clubs that you don't like, and they'll have clubs that other people don't like. But those are going to be there, and that's not going away based on this legislation. It doesn't limit the appearance of guest speakers with some, that as long as its attendance is voluntary. It doesn't limit academic freedom. It does not limit academic freedom. That will be the most common thing that you'll hear. They'll say, our faculty, our teachers should be able to have academic freedom to teach what they want. And this does not limit that. It just says students have to have an option to not be compelled to be taught this. It also doesn't prohibit any program or training that's generated to comply with Title IX, the American Disabilities Act, Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act. I mean, those are the things that that you'll commonly hear. They'll say, these people are racist and they wanna, do away with these things because they don't like people of other nationalities. That's ridiculous. You can have all of that. You can have the clubs, but you can't force it on our young people any longer. You can't force it on the students in our higher education. So with that, that wraps up the legislation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
Who hires the administrators that push this?
So the question is, who hires the administrators that push this? The president of the colleges would be hiring the administration of the colleges. Well, one thing I would say is that I think that some of them, and I forgot to do something, and I apologize. At the very beginning, I wanted to applaud the State Board of Education's work. They've already introduced 3 resolutions that I think moves us in the right direction. And so I'm encouraged by that. And they also, in the same meeting, I believe that where they approved those resolutions, they also agreed that there's work that needs to be done by the legislature in this realm. So I would say to some degree, they actually called for this legislation to happen. So that was very encouraging, and I'm hopeful that we can get things on track. I would say that if administration is really against this type of legislation, they may find a job at UW or Harvard, places where their ideas are more welcome.
How you doing? Dwight McCarty from Eagle, Idaho. Thank you for being here to all 3 of the presenters. So it seems to me like we keep writing laws on top of laws that were in place from before. Like obviously we have free speech, and then if you look at the last bunch of years, I'm sure that somebody has said we should probably say don't discriminate on race or whatever, and then we keep forgetting it because that was 50 years ago, then it was 30 years ago, here we are again. Like we need to write the same law sort of over and over and over again. So how do we just enforce the same commonsensical laws that we already have versus retelling the same sort of story? And to answer the other thing, like we saw Harvard and Princeton's president got kicked out because they finally were too much. So it does happen that we can enforce that stuff, but thank you.
Yeah, so as far as, I don't disagree with you that that there's a lot of law already in place. I'd say a lot of it just goes back to the Constitution. But the reality is that these things have wormed their way into our institutions of higher education. Unfortunately, those are their own, they kind of have their own mechanisms for how they run. And so I think to the degree, I'd say that we don't have the laws in place that direct them what they can and can't do in this arena, even though I agree with you that a lot of this is really common sense, about as common sense as you can get.
Thanks. Hi, Senator. It seems like you're dealing with a problem that comes from government, politics, with government and politics. So why don't we, you're trying to treat an infection with the infectious agent. So why don't we just do what the common sense obvious solution is that I think everybody here knows, and that is get government out of education 100%, have a competitive school system that is unregulated, free market system, unregulated, that the parents can choose, like they choose a barber or a plumber, and do it that way. If we try to do it this way, it's not going to happen. So, and the other thing is, there are 2 problems, 2 reasons why our society is where it is. I'm supposed to ask you a question, but I'll ask you at the end. And that is also they control the monetary system. So we also need to go back to a gold and silver system to compete against the Federal Reserve System, which controls everything in society. That's why our Pentagon, our press, our politicians are worthless, because they're bought and sold by the people that control the money. So, well, what do you think about that? Do you think that those 2 solutions would work? And so what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, that'd be great. First, let me just say this. As a legislator, I feel like my responsibility is really over the finances of our state and over the universities of our state. And I think that your question addresses things at a much higher level than that.
And I'd just like to add, and I'm willing to be, politely disagree with the first part of your sentence or question there. The first land-grant university in this country was founded by Thomas Jefferson. When he died, he put 3 things on his grave. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the author of Religious Freedom in Virginia, but he was also the founder of the University of Virginia. These land-grant institutions have always been a part of our DNA as a country, right? They're fundamental to Republican government. I am only where I am today because I had the pleasure of going to the University of Nevada, Reno. I have so many people here. I mean, you drive around town. They're so proud of their university. They're proud to be a Vandal. They're proud to be a Bulldog. I'm proud to be a member of the Wolf Pack, right? You see it on their cars. People love these institutions, and they can be a part of the common good again. So I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater here, right? And I think what we can do, though, is that we can reform them and bring them back to their initial, what they're meant to be established for, and make people proud of these institutions again. Please do. Possibly, but, appeal to authority. I believe in our founders and their system of government they created, and they believe that these institutions can be something that is positive, and I believe that we can make them something like that again.
They have been for a long time.
Fair enough. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I don't need it. Okay. Yeah. My name is Scott Robinson from CUNA. Thank you for this bill.
Yeah.
I worked in the school districts in the Treasure Valley, mostly at the elementary level. So I think this is a good start, but the indoctrination starts when they're little. It starts in preschool all the way through. I was wondering if there's anything going on right now, any bills or any way we can get involved. I know people get involved at the school board levels, but as far as you brought up the Attorney General here, Labrador, bringing some penalties against the universities. These people that teach, especially, untruths like kids can be whatever they want for that day, and the sexuality that goes on in the school districts, teaching them, giving them hormones, and I don't know how much that happens here, but I do know the school psychologists and teachers do promote that as somewhat. Can there be penalties, criminal penalties for people that teach kids? If I go to a little kid out in the public and say, "Hey, Johnny or Susie, you can be whatever you want for the day, and your sexuality is your choice. A girl can be a boy." I can go to jail for that. Correct? I'm wondering, is there anything coming up? Well, I should be. I mean, you're damaging a kid emotionally. For sure. So I'm just wondering if there's anything at that level, because that's where it starts, is the little guys. And I'm glad you're looking at the universities, but the elementary level is where they're indoctrinated all the way through up. And then by the time they get to the university levels, you've got your hands full with people that are, doing what they're doing right now. So that's my question. I don't know. That's long.
No, thank you for the question. I will say this. My first session, this is my third session, so I'm fairly new here, but my first session, I brought a bill that prohibited any sexual training or radical gender theory or anything like that in our grade schools. I was so passionate about the bill. I was so confident that, 95%, hopefully more, of our citizens would agree with that. It passed through the Senate, but not without some trouble, some debates, and then it got drawered in the House. And that was when I realized that there is still evil, and there is still a block against what you're talking about, doing what's right for our students at the elementary school level. It was mind-boggling. I could not believe it. I thought that it would be the easiest piece of legislation that I would ever sponsor. But the reality is, yes, there's a battle going on there. I brought it again, and it got amended before it even got introduced. So I'm not giving up on that either. I'll keep on fighting. But you're exactly right. It starts at a really young level, a really young age, and we can see the way it plays out. We have a higher and higher percentage of young people, usually in middle school, that are either LGBT or any LGBTQ type. I think that at some places they said it's up to 20%. And so how does that start? Like, why is that number so high? And you're exactly right. It starts very young. It starts sometimes in our elementary schools. And I'll tell you, this stuff starts in elementary schools too. My wife, I think it's her hairdresser, was telling her a story about her son had come home from school crying and saying he doesn't want to be white. And his mom's like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "I don't want to be white anymore." And when she got to the bottom of it, they had him doing a project where the white kids in a playground were leaving all the black kids out, and they were excluding them. And so the way that this little guy, maybe a third grader, the way that he internalized that was that it was bad to be white. That's sad. That's wrong. We have to get that out of our schools. And I think it's done at the local level by people running for school board. And I'd love to see that piece of legislation I was talking about get all the way through, and I'm hopeful it will in the future.
Hello.
The person who drored it is no longer a legislator, but I don't really call people out.
So we have Idaho's a right to work state. Why are the unions still involved in education? I mean, they follow what the unions want them to do, and it all seems to come around money, because the unions wouldn't be here without the money. But that and equity, equity is, a lot of people don't understand that, but it's not equality, it's equity.
Correct.
Okay, it's payback is what it is.
Right.
And being a black man, I know what payback is. Having a white wife, I know what they try to get me to do, and we've seen that in this election, where the black people are I don't usually do racial things, so. But anyway, equity is what's happening with a lot of it.
Yeah, so your point about it coming from the national level teachers unions, I don't disagree with you. I see a lot of it being pushed from there. I actually have a bill that I'm not very hopeful we'll get a hearing that would just simply stop our schools from deducting the dues for the people that are in the teachers unions, making it easier for them to recruit and keep members. I have a bill, it's already passed through the House and it's now in the Senate, but it's going to be really tough to get a hearing on that bill. But I'm in agreement with you. I think that we're funding our own demise when we help with that.
We have time for one more question. Right here, ma'am. Sorry, it doesn't go that far. It's for the internet, so they can hear the question.
The Department of Education at the federal level, why do we need that? We can just do this at the state level. States are sovereign anyway, and what's the problem?
I'm just going to say I agree with you. I mean, there's not a lot more to say than that. Like, why are they in this business at all? I have no idea, and I'm hopeful that some of that is going to go away with the current administration. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, these, that's one, we might disagree here in this room about whether we should burn Boise State down to the ground, but, I think we can all agree at least that the Department of Education at the federal level should not have a place in our education system here in Idaho. Well, I believe that's our time. I appreciate everyone for coming out. Jake, do you have any final comments for anyone about future Capital Clarities?
Yes. Please join us next Thursday.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.